This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello and welcome to my Monday night show. I am Hannah Wilson, and tonight we're going to be talking about teacher training. Are we preparing trainees well enough, and are we really showing them the reality of teaching and making sure they're prepared and can stay in teaching? Feel free to call in or write in your thoughts or messages or questions.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to this Monday night in the holidays, and thank you for joining me. We're going to be chatting about teacher training and kind of things that you wish you knew before you started, and what kind of things will help you stay in teaching, and how can we get people to stay in teaching. I'm just going to go through some facts that I've read. There was an actual census on number of trainee teachers by the FE News, so from Education News, and it was quite interesting to see kind of the numbers. So total new entrants were down 20%, so down to 28,991, as opposed to in 21-22 it was 36,000. Postgraduate entrants were down from 23%, so 23,224, down from 30,000. Undergraduate entrance was 5,767, so down from 5%. So it's a real interesting to see how far they're falling down, but obviously there's a lot more people leaving as well. So there's a real gap in terms of recruitment. Their recruitment targets were really not reached. So primary subjects, their targets were missed by 131%. And secondary subjects were down from 79% to 59%. So primary was down from 131 to 93. So it's quite interesting to see the amount that aren't coming into education and staying in education. And I think that kind of is quite interesting at looking how it is. And of course, it's the school holidays. So I've just been enjoying my son.
My phone.
Just watch telly. Oh. You're allowed telly for this hour.
Oh.
Do you want to say hello to everybody?
Yeah.
What do you say?
Hello.
One future teacher there. Hello, Lydia. You've come on and called in. Now, you're. We work together, so we've been chatting about this, haven't we? About kind of teacher training and how we get to it, and there's loads of different routes. So should we start by chatting about kind of how did you get into teaching, and then we'll go into mine, because I've got a bit of a different route, and I think yours is slightly different as well.
Yeah, mine's. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can. So
mine's a bit of an interesting one, because it's quite step by step, in that I never thought I was going to be a teacher, and I sort of. But from the age of 16, I worked a lot with pupils with special educational needs, and I did a lot of outreach with my sixth form, and I used to run a performing arts programme with a local special needs school. And then I went to university and did the whole student ambassador thing, where I spent a lot of time going into different schools and doing all those things. And I think through that, in my final year of uni, I decided I wanted to become a teacher, but I really wanted to make sure it was the right route, because there is a lot of chat that I'm sure we'll talk about later about what schools are actually like when you get into them. So having had some experiences in a lot of different types of schools, I decided to stick with somewhat what I knew, and did a year as a TA in a special needs school, a school specialism for autism, and spent a year doing that before I then went and did a year of teacher training through university. So I did that sort of the PGCE route, but then that got hit by COVID, so I actually only did, I think, 2 or 3 weeks of my placement 2 before we were sort of sent off. So I was one of the year that went from having taught maximum of sort of 12 hours in a week to a full timetable in the following September, and then having to deal with the subsequent lockdowns post that and teaching online, for which we had absolutely no training.
And that's the thing. I do think teaching has changed so much since COVID. And I'll actually go through some facts that I found out about on that. So Ed Week, they surveyed 700 teachers and 300 school leaders in March 2001. So obviously this was after the pandemic. And pre-COVID, it asked like, how likely were you to leave the teaching profession? And the answers were very likely, somewhat likely, somewhat unlikely, or very unlikely. So somewhat likely and very unlikely were pre-COVID was 34%, whereas after COVID, when they asked what is the likelihood that you'll leave in the teaching in the next 2 years, it rose to 54%. So that's quite a big jump, and I think that just shows kind of how hard teaching's become lately.
Yeah, I think there's been a real shift. I think part of it comes from a lot of students and parents actually almost now see schools as more of an optional thing, because during COVID, there was a lot of schools doing a lot of different things. I think everybody was doing their best, but I think a lot of students were left to their own devices to get on with things, and they kind of saw school as something that, oh well, that they couldn't really do. It wasn't really working for a lot of people. They didn't have the necessary access, and I think that's sort of it's a big landmark of a change that we've experienced. That's been a sort of it's been a slow change in the last 10 years with education, but I think it's been a more significant change since COVID towards the perspective of teachers and education and schools. And I think we're now seeing a lot more of the TikTok trends making joke of teachers in the classroom and members of teaching staff that potentially isn't done for other careers. And I think like that they're calling it a recruitment and retention crisis. And I think a lot of it has to do with the view of the profession as a whole. And I think the previous benefits that were perceived to be with being a teacher maybe aren't there anymore. And I think people aren't wanting to go into it because they're seeing it being mocked in the media, they're seeing it being mocked on TikTok, but then they're also seeing it not being really regarded as a profession from our own government. And I think that then affects that people want to go into it. I think whereas my generation, the generations above me, might have been in school looking up to their teachers, and a lot of all of that their teachers do, and therefore thinking that maybe they might want to become one. I think there's less of that now because the behaviour has worsened within schools. There's a few national statistics on that, but I think all of that has led to people not actually seeing it as a profession that they aspire to. I think it's more
And
become a
yeah,
profession that's perceived as like, oh, if you're doing a certain subject and you can't think of what to do, be a teacher for a bit and then do something.
yeah, the emphasis has changed, hasn't it? Like, you used to go into teaching because that was like your career, that was your passion, and it was quite well advocated, like it's quite well paid, long holidays, very rewarding. And I think that's judgment's changed, that very much that phrase of those that can't teach, and that it's like this negative thing, and that you can't be successful in other jobs, so therefore you must, that's the only reason you can teach. And this whole like public perception of teachers is that like everything is like, oh well, you get so much holiday, and you barely work, you only work till 3 o'clock. The narrative of what a teacher isn't a positive one. And I do think they've got those TV adverts where they're trying to encourage people into teaching, but they're not really kind of battling really that kind of
I think they actually do
persona.
more damage than good because because they're presenting such a polar opposite of what everybody already thinks of teaching. It almost is seen as a joke because like the advert themselves is like, oh, every lesson changes a life, and I can't remember what some of the other slogans are, but they're all very, oh, it's amazing. There's like, and I guess it would be when you're trying to advertise for people to do something, but there needs to be a certain level of how realistic is that, and people are aware that that's. I mean, everyone's been through education themselves. They know that every lesson of their own life did not shape their life. Some of them did, but actually, every single lesson potentially not. I just think that the way that they're attempting to tackle it doesn't really work. And at the moment, I think both sides of the government's perception actually is to just throw money at the problem. Um, but actually that doesn't fix it, because we can see that when people are getting increased bonuses and or the increased money going into the first few years of being like an M1 or M2, actually people are still dropping out in droves. So the way isn't even to con people into the profession and then hope they stay, but actually they're not even staying that long. I think that the cohort that I did my PGCE with, many of them now aren't teachers. Many of them have gone on to do other things because the demands on their time and the demands on the stress level they have to encounter each day are so much lower, and they see it as a lot more sustainable long term, and they can see where they're going. And I think that's a real big problem.
I completely agree. I think we were discussing it on the weekly show a couple of weeks ago about the idea that the government were going to do like a bonus if you like stayed for 2 years or what have you. And it's like I don't know whether that's going to get people to stay in the profession.
I think getting people to stay in the profession is about actually making them have things that they want to achieve. I think there's a, a slight issue in a lot of schools now where if you stay being quote unquote only a teacher, then you're not seen as progressing enough. But then the salary ranges and things don't really benefit you if you don't then move up into either the leadership scale or through the TLRs. And so what happens is people are looking to having to progress when they potentially actually just want to be a class teacher. And furthermore to that, I think the other issue that I'm certainly in the category of I don't want to be a head teacher or a vice principal, or even realistically I don't know if I'd ever want to even be an assistant principal, because I look at what those people in the different schools that I've worked at have to do and the time that they don't have with their families and the pressure that's put on them, and it's not always that healthy. And they might love their job, but then what are they giving it up to get there? And I think there's very few professions where your main pathway is that.
It's that whole thing, isn't it? And as well as that, if teachers are good, there's that kind of quite quick to give them extra responsibilities. I know that in a previous school that I worked at, a lot of NQTs were given head of department roles or head of year roles, and I just felt like they weren't ready for it. And actually, it would provided like burnout too quickly, that they kind of jumped up this ladder before actually kind of honing their skills. And I think
Yeah, but it's also
it's
about
okay to be in that place, isn't it? It's okay to just sit there and be a classroom teacher and actually understand it and become good at it.
Yeah, but I also think that people need to recognise it's a different skill set. Somebody can be an amazing teacher, but absolutely pants head of year, or they can be a really phenomenal teacher, but not so good as a head of a department, because they're a different skill set. Being a head of department requires a lot more like overall organisation, but it also requires you to be able to manage people and have diplomatic conversations and do all of these things. So asking somebody in their first year of training to master two separate skill sets at the same time is unrealistic, but it's also unrealistic to say that people ever want to be in that position. Not everybody wants to be a manager. Not everybody wants to have, or for example, be in the pastoral position where they're having to deal with really serious events as a head of year. And it's an interesting problem that we have in schools, where I actually think we've not got enough diversity of roles in there, but we also don't have enough other professions in there. I mean, we all know that the social work support, the police support, all of the even mental health support, a lot of it has been withdrawn or reduced from schools. And it's almost like teachers are left on their own to plug in the gaps. But we're not trained. Like we're dealing with an unprecedented amount of mental health in schools, and there's all the data to back that up and the effect of COVID has, but we don't have the training on it. Like these NQTs or they're called now ECTs, so they do their 1 year training when they've been in 2 placements and they've maybe done 45 days at best of education with a provider alongside that. And then we're expecting them to go into schools, be able to adequately deliver all the material, but alongside that, have the knowledge of how to support students in their mental health and how to navigate all these various different things. And I think that's where a lot of this initial dropout comes from, because people can't do it. It's not realistic, and it never has been. And that's why the retention isn't just at the early career point that's an issue. We've also got a problem with people keeping people sort of towards nearing retirement, where potentially before they might have stayed a few more years, they're leaving a few years early because they feel like it's worsening in that situation. So they'd
Yeah, I
rather
agree.
leave.
I was looking at the retirement figures as well, just as a contrast, and they last year was the first year they didn't kind of drop, and I think that's perhaps those teachers going, "I'll just give it one more year because they if you stayed in teaching till you're retiring, you really really love teaching and you don't want to see a school struggle, and with the majority of these like kind of gaps in education being filled by cover teachers or teachers that isn't their subject, like you would feel like kind of a duty to almost stay if you could. But I do think over the next couple of years, we're going to see that really drop off where people have stayed longer than they should have. And now we're going to suddenly get a drop and we're not getting them in from the other end and they're not staying. I think it's something a third of teachers leaving the profession within the next 5 years, according to tests, and that was 2 years ago. So we are right on time for there to be a mass exit. And I think also with kind of the strikes and everything, and that not helping the public perception of teachers, it's not why would somebody want to get into teaching now with how teaching has been shown in the media. And I think it is the thing, every time there is something, it's like, oh, we'll go and clap for the nurses, we'll praise the doctors and the ambulance workers, and rightly so. But it's like, oh well, the teachers want another day off, do they? And it's like, you do know we lose pay. Like, I spoke to my friend, I'm not in a striking union, but I spoke to a friend who was, and she lost something like £1,500 doing the strikes, and with the increased pay it barely balances out because she loses her child benefit. And it's just like, it was like, but we're doing it because we wanted it to come out of the government's budget as opposed to the school budgets, because we didn't want the children to lose out. But that wasn't really reported in the media.
We've been backed in a corner with that anyway, because the most of the unions now saying, well, we're backed into a corner of accepting, even though half of it is unfunded and schools can't afford that. No, but nobody's addressing the fact that the funding for schools is not anywhere near where it should be, full stop. But especially considering the fact that we've got increased mental health difficulties within schools, we've got an increased number of diagnosed kids waiting for EHCPs, but also where we're trying to put provision in when, well, we don't have anything for it. And I think that's why another reason why we've got a retention crisis is because teachers are looking at their class. They might have a class of 30 in front of them with 5 kids in there with quite significant mental health issues, another 5 kids in there who have special educational needs, and then maybe another 5 who are EAL. And actually trying to manage that and plan for that and produce the resources and support all those students, it's not realistic, because if the student's having a mental health crisis, a lot of the time, well, they're waiting 2 or 3 or 4 years before they can be seen or spoken to by a professional. And in the meantime, schools are paying for counsellors to come in off their own back to try and support them, but then schools can't afford that, and they can only give it to a couple of students.
And I think it's that as well. As a new teacher, you don't expect that. That isn't something that you're expecting to happen. You expect to go in, teach in front of a class, and that be it. You don't expect the kind of role that you have in terms of having to support students and their mental health and their learning needs, like how much that is. And I think as you go through the teaching career and you've been there, done that, it is easier to manage. But I think that's something that we don't prepare trainee teachers for enough, the reality of how many different needs there would be within one class, especially if you're teaching a mixed ability set. Like the H class is going to have a completely different makeup, and it's just, that's quite hard to get your head around at the start. And if you don't master that, I think that makes teaching really difficult as well.
Yeah, and I've also heard amongst sort of colleagues as well in different schools that there is almost this rhetoric that the people who have it hardest in a school, and I actually agree, the people who are working the hardest in school are often the teachers, who are only the teachers and who don't have additional responsibilities. Because often what happens is with additional responsibilities comes increased planning time for those responsibilities. And so people have more time, they're less contact, they have more time to actually navigate this. And it's the people who are just the teachers and don't have any additional responsibilities who are firefighting and I think frankly surviving. I think when we speak to a lot of ECTs and in those first times, a lot of the time people do seem to feel like they're just surviving the week by week and getting to the half terms and spending a good chunk of that half term doing work anyway. It's just more relaxed work.
It's that for me. I feel like I cope quite well because I'm in it well over a decade. I know what I'm doing, but I also feel like if I had more time, I could make better resources. I could plan better. I could mark better. I could teach better. I feel like everything is at a rush. Like I'm getting everything done that I want to get done, but I'm doing it to the kind of the lowest standard because if I did it to a high standard, gosh, I could spend twice as long on it and I would never have a life. And it's that balance. Like I would love to have an extra kind of, even if it was one day every half a term where I could really plan and get to grips and implement stuff, the effect and the positive effect it could have on my teaching. And I don't think that kind of the government understand that. Like we're all professionals, we all love what we do, we're all very good at what we do, but we do not have the time to do it to our best of our abilities, and that's the issue.
I think interestingly to add on to that, I think that that's a huge problem with the retention crisis because I mean I've just started doing my analysis of my master's research project on staff teaching students with EAL. And one of the things that comes up continually in all of the different research is time, in that teachers don't have enough time to adequately prepare for having EAL students in their class. And what happens is that students themselves don't get the support and therefore make the progress as expected. But alongside that, actually, the feelings amongst staff is that they're letting students down, that they're failing these students. And no adult goes into teaching to fail students. We all go into it as a career that we want to teach and we want to see students succeeding and help them achieve the best that they can. And actually feeling like we're failing students just, I mean, is appalling. There's so much data specifically for EAL students, but also for different groups of students, that we're not in this country adequately supporting them. They're not making the expected progress. The only group that are making their expected progress is the students with EAL who are already fluent in English. And if they're not considered fluent in English or at any level below, they fall below their expected progress. And no, we shouldn't be in that position, but staff also shouldn't be in a position where they feel like they're failing students. It's not making anybody feel good about their job if they feel like they're scraping through their teaching.
And I think that's the thing with teacher training, is that they need to give like the trainee the same group and not like jump around. They need to have time to get to know those kids and really have somebody sit down with them and really analyze the class so they know exactly what's to come, so they're more prepared for it. I remember the best training I did actually was when I first started at school, and one of the inset, they only did it as a one-off, but I feel like actually that would have been really good if it was an every year thing. And we all had our classes printed out on, we just did it for Key Stage 4, but we all had our classes printed out on little sheets with their names and their needs and kind of their prior attaining and what their targets are and things like that. And it was really nice because I hadn't been there very long, and I was like, I can't work out this kid. And then I'd go and speak to somebody on a different table and they'd be like, oh yeah, no, sit her with this person and they'll work well together. And it was having that whole collaborative process. I was like, I can't quite work out this kid, because I think it was like after half a term in or a term in, and like I'd go and chat to the SEN table. They were like, oh, you need to do this and this, and it's like it was this great kind of collaborative process where you could almost wander around the room, see what students other people had and their combinations. And I think seeing how other teachers who have done it for a while or know those students, how they put them together and how they manage those classes is lost a little bit in teacher training. That kind of real organic collaborative, we'll help you because we're going to have the time, we're going to sit and do that now. Whereas it seems to be the rush kind of just read their passport kind of thing, because people just don't have the time to sit and do it properly.
I think that's what it comes down to, though, isn't it? It's time. Like, teacher training itself is a short period of time. The time, like, generally mentors aren't given extra time to be a mentor.
No.
And if they are, it's maybe an hour a fortnight or an hour a week, which really isn't adequate. And I mean, I think that's where it comes down to, is we can't expect people to go from not ever really teaching before to handling a full timetable. Just achieving that within a year is a feat in itself. But then actually expecting them to be competent in all these other things that at the moment, and especially since COVID, have risen up as an issue, that as a time demand. I think everybody is so much more pushed within school for time, because so much more is expected of every member of the staff. I think teachers are doing more than they've ever done. Head teachers are doing more than they've ever done. I think I saw Gillian Keegan the other day suggesting that head teachers should go and pick up students from their houses who aren't coming into school. I mean, where does that stop? I mean, that isn't the role of the schools. Like, we're not babysitters. We're here to teach and support these students and their progress, both their personal development as well as their academic development. But I mean, we're adding more and more year on year into what schools are expected to do. We've added in the dental things because the dental levels of our country dropped, so we now do more education on how to brush your teeth and all those various different things. Primary schools have seen more kids showing up not still in nappies and not toilet trained, so then they're getting on to doing that. But there's not time. We don't have time to do all of those things and run all these various different things because other resources are being cut.
I think that it's that, isn't it? We need to do a better job. But one of the things that they have done, so obviously you did a slightly more typical route in, but had COVID get in the way. I went straight in as an instructor covering maternity leave. I had a master's degree, but I hadn't taught before other than my interview lesson, and I managed to get the job over qualified teachers. So it must have been the blood. If you haven't listened to that one where I got it from, have a go back through my podcast and listen to my one with my sister. But then I did that for a couple of years, and then I did basically a salary directed route. So I was teaching a 0.8 timetable. So I taught full for 4 days a week, and then on a Friday I went and did my teacher training, and then I did kind of 14 Fridays in another school for my second placement, and then I think there was a week where I went and did an SEN school and a primary school and stuff at the start. So mine was kind of slightly different, but obviously they've kind of opened it up now. So you can have a degree and you've worked in schools and you want to get a qualification, you can either do the postgraduate apprenticeship or the assessment only route. So obviously if you've worked in schools for a while, I was kind of borderline for that. I could have created a portfolio and submitted that, but I actually wanted to do the course and actually learn from it. You have a degree. Again, you can do the postgraduate teacher training. So there's PD dips, there's skit and things like that as well, or initial teacher training. But you don't have a degree, so you can do the undergraduate degree and then do the teacher training. But they're doing the new apprenticeships where you don't have to have a degree, but you can go in that route as well to try and kind of recruit people. I think that's kind of quite a nice one because it should get more. I think it's quite good for people that are like LSAs and things that want to get into teaching and can transfer over. Because I listened to one of Tom's Twitter shows, and on that they had the actual lady who was the mentor and the trainee teacher, and she had been an LSA but didn't have a degree. 6 years, I think it was, doing an open university degree before being able to get onto her course. But if they had the apprenticeship, she'd have been able to get straight in. Whereas I went straight in and did it as a train instructor, having not got a qualification, and they got the qualification later. But she, in theory, would have had way more experience in the classroom than I did teaching it. So it's.
But I think there's an interesting debate there, because actually they're doing a similar thing with medicine. So you can now become a doctor without doing a degree. And I think there's some obvious problems with that. But I think with teaching, I think I support different routes into teaching. I think that we've got a really good range, but I do wonder how much subject specialism we're going to start losing with teachers who haven't necessarily done a degree in the topic, because being able to successfully teach some of these subjects, and I'm not saying all subjects, I think that is actually in fact quite subject dependent, but I think it could become a very fine line. For example, so I'm science based. Just doing your A levels in the subject is not necessarily going to give you the depth of knowledge within a lot of these courses to then be able to teach it at GCSE and A level successfully, purely because in the last however many years they've brought down a lot of the content into A levels and GCSEs that was previously at university level. And I sort of wonder how easy it is to go the other way, because we're expecting graduates knowing the content to learn the teaching skill, and sort of introducing this next route kind of adds the opposite. So we've got people who will have the teaching skill but not necessarily the content.
And I think it's the same as I had somebody the other day chatting on one of the shows, and they were saying that they were a science teacher, but their expertise was one of the other subjects, and they had a real gap of they didn't have anybody to fill A-level physics, and they wanted to do it, but they could not find a course anywhere that would upskill them in it. So I think that there's a loophole there. In terms of the doctor thing, it's quite interesting because my sister is a nurse and she did a medical degree, became a nurse, and she's done the qualification. So basically she's the equivalent of a doctor and can prescribe, but she's not an actual doctor. So in that respect, she's the loophole in terms of she's been a nurse for kind of 20 years and done A&E, done GP, everything, but she's the equivalent of, like, she's got kind of high level qualifications in various different medical procedures, but she's now a consultant nurse. But she's not a doctor, so she can't earn as much as a doctor, and she can't have a doctor name, but she can do everything that the doctor in the GP surgery does. So it's kind of
because they've introduced, like, this year, that I understand that because that makes a lot of sense, but they've introduced people going from A levels with no previous medical experience to go into becoming a doctor and train on the job in a hospital.
And I think that's the thing with the apprenticeships for teaching. I think they're good, but I think there should be a loophole that they've got to have done LSA work or been in a school environment for a certain amount of time prior to doing it. And I think actually that if we kind of almost made it a 2-year course with the apprenticeship, if you really want to go into it without having to go and do a 3-year degree, go do a year as an LSA where you literally absorb everything you possibly can and really see and make sure it's for you, and then go in and have a year where you actually full on teach and do all the theory and stuff as well. And like the first year as an LSA, you would kind of gain all the information about kind of SEN kids and behavior and things like that, and you'd hone those crafts. And then the second one would be all about like planning the lessons and pacing and timing. And actually, rather than, because I just feel like 1 year for teacher training isn't quite enough time to get everything done to make somebody fully prepared to go into it. But also, if you're not a key subject and you're trying to do that like without funding, you can't physically work and do your teacher training. There just isn't enough hours. So how are we expecting people to survive? Because they would have finished uni. So these are like people in their 20s. They probably don't want to live at home. They're not going to have the money to be able to work to work for free for a year to do their teacher training. It's a really tough situation.
I agree, but then arguably you could say with the salaries of LSAs and TAs where they are at the moment, that it's arguably not actually even affordable for a lot of people to work as a LSA or TA for a year. Because what you're suggesting is effectively what I did put myself through. I put myself through being a TA and then did the teacher training, which I think was hugely valuable. And I still draw on experiences that I've had from them. And I often find that I've had a lot more experience than sometimes more experienced teachers with certain students and certain disabilities or diagnoses, because I have had a more breadth of experience in that rather than training and staying at one school, for example. But yeah, I think they need to think about it more than just about getting people into teaching, because even if we get all the people we can into teaching, it's not worth anything unless we can get them to stay.
Yeah. And how do we better prepare them? Because I feel like that would prepare them more if they had a 2-year thing, one thing focusing on kind of behaviour and SEN and and EAL and things like that, and then a year kind of on your teaching craft. But other than that, other than me getting voted to be education secretary and taking the world over, what can we do
You go, girl.
now?
I think we need to have a better system of what actually happens once staff get into school. I think for a profession where we're in front of students most of our time, we've weirdly got not a lot of time with colleagues.
Yeah.
Like in your average day, the only time that you get with colleagues is potentially at a lunchtime. The rest of the time, you're in front of students, and I think a lot of it for newly qualified teachers is faking it till they're making it and putting a face on and hoping and gritting and getting on with it. I mean, but we don't have that unless you've got a really, really strong department, which, I mean, the data's showing is happening less and less. That it gets harder. I mean, like we've got we've got so few maths teachers now and physics teachers, but we've got so few maths teachers that we've got people who have no qualifications in it trying to teach it, and they don't know what they're doing because maths isn't something that is necessarily like another subject. It has its own set of skills and techniques to teach with, and I think we can prepare people all we want before we go into something, but they need the coaching and the support once they're in it. And I think whatever people want to call it, whether it's mentoring or instructional coaching or whatever name or new theory that people want to use, I think actually what people need when they first become a teacher is another member of staff who's more experienced being brutally honest with them and actually offering them some support. I think actually it can feel quite confrontational to have a member of staff with you who is trying to give you advice on what to do with things, but you feel like you're being judged by them. And I know since changing the ECT framework, that
isn't it, trying to take away that kind of being like observed. Like I feel like that's seen as such a negative thing, and I feel like that should be turned into more of a positive thing with teacher training and continued throughout. Like I'm very much a little bit crazy that when Ofsted turn up, I emailed going, if you don't get them to me, I will be annoyed. Like I want them in my classroom. Like I want them. My team are great. Like hands up, it should be me. But I feel like that's how every kind of department should feel. But instead of, I'm just very, very used to it. The school I was at prior to ours, it had very much an open door policy. Like I had the classroom next to their deputy head. He would wander in on a daily basis and wander out. And at the start, I was like, what did you think? Like, I haven't had any feedback. And he's like, oh, I just wander in and out. I just wander around and look at everybody's lessons. If I'm worried, then I'll come talk to you. But I won't come talk to you if it was fine. Like I might comment about it in like briefing if I saw something that I enjoyed, but generally I'm just wandering around. And I feel like that's kind of disappeared a little bit in terms of, granted, because SLT are exceptionally busy and probably don't have as much time now to wander around and pop into people's lessons, but it should be this kind of this organic thing that's comes from kind of teacher training, that you should welcome people into your lesson, you should welcome feedback. Like that's how you grow. We are the advocates of trying to get students to learn, and we should lead by example by saying that we're never done learning. We always need to keep learning and keep growing, and that we need to bring people into our classrooms and have other people's perspectives, and that's a good thing, not a negative thing.
I think it's not even about how we frame it anymore. I think it's just about giving the time to do it. Like, we don't have the time, in my opinion, in an average timetable where you get the sort of average allotted time off or PPA time. I think you don't have the time to spend going and looking at other classes or people coming to look in your class and then having time to give you feedback, but because no matter how good a school is at promoting ongoing staff learning and even sort of providing books and providing resources and providing access to National College or whatever it may be, the reality is if you don't give staff time to access it and time to use it, then you're expecting staff to do all of this in their own time, and that isn't realistic comparable to most other careers. Most other careers, if you're expected to go on these courses, it's during your work time and you're paid for it. If you're expected to read something or do an online course, it's in your paid time. It's not in time that you're making up on your own. I think that sort of access is the problem here, is because like our school has access to online resources. It has we have access to books and things, but actually the time needed to use it and to access it, if you're running yourself thin during each day using your allotted time, it becomes hard. I mean, I know I've tried to look at my time slots to try and go and look at other lessons, but when it comes down to it, actually you've got a whole long list of things to do and lessons to prepare for. It needs to be, that has to take priority, and I think more recently that's what's happened is teachers are doing it off their own back, and as lovely as that is, and I'm part of that crew, like it's a problem in terms of what we're expecting of adults.
Yeah, because that's my thing, is that I always tell my trainees, like, don't stop doing CPD, don't stop learning, don't think that those after school sessions that you have as an ECT are really dull and boring and not interesting and a waste of your evening. They're your bread and butter. That's where you learn and that's where you develop. Yes, there'll be bad ones, but there'll be ones that will stick with you forever. And it is that kind of minefield. And I was actually on my master's course the other day, and one of the ladies was saying that we should, like, it shouldn't be kind of inset is a horrible word. It should be kind of continued development. Very much a culture that will chuck people on the free ones, because that's like, we don't have a budget, just go on a free one. And we're chucking people on things that are free because they're free, because that's, the schools don't have budgets, and they're not necessarily going on quality CPD. We're not making the time for them to have kind of quality CPD and keep that learning. And I know ECTs get like an extra hour, but like, I've honed my skills over kind of 12 years of teaching, and that I can mark a set of books in 20 minutes. But in my early days, that like a set of books is taking me a good hour. And like, they don't have that time to develop themselves and work out kind of where they want to learn and what they need to learn about, and where to find those resources as well. It's quite an interesting one that you kind of are kind of just left into the teaching profession, that I feel like it should be this kind of narrative that schools are like, we need to keep learning, this is what we want to learn about, these are all the things we've found that are available this term if people want to go on them, or somebody can go on one and feed back and tell everybody about it. Like, it needs to be more of a kind of a culture as teachers that we kind of continuously learn and develop. Otherwise, you sit there and you're not up to date with the research. You don't know how students are changing, technology is changing, the way students learn is changing. If you don't keep up, you're going to struggle to teach your class and get the results that you need, because then everyone else will be developing.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, aside from there's not money to go on the course, even if sometimes it is a free course, the problem comes is, oh, you need cover for your class, and that costs money. So then there's another way that things can't get paid for. But I think it's an ongoing problem, isn't it? Because we can always want to try and upskill and try and improve ourselves, but if it doesn't feel like it's being able to be successful, we've got problems. I mean, I think it was Alan Boxer that talked about there's an issue with one person doing training and then feeding back to everybody, because it ends up being a kind of like Chinese whispers, in that one person learns something, might have been Tom Sherrington, and when one person learns something and then tries to feed it back to others, they don't themselves fully understand it until they've put it into practice and done it really in quite a lot of depth. And so I think a lot of schools have tried to do that. They send one person on the course, and then that person comes and does a Twilight or an evening session, and then everybody's upskilled in that one thing. And the reality is they're not. But equally, I think there's not enough of a conversation about how we can lighten teachers' workload. I think with the introduction of AI and how that can be helpful, and the sharing of resources, there is a possibility here to reduce the workload and what we can achieve in each amount of time. I mean, realistically, for most subjects now, we don't need the level of marking that used to exist in schools.
No.
Because in my previous school, before I moved to R1, we were doing an insane amount of marking, and I was that person that was sort of staying until 6 o'clock, because our books were expected to be marked sort of once per 4 weeks, and then each class was expected to have a test done every half term. So then you're looking at a whole second lot of marking, and then you've got your big assessments that need to be marked, and then the exam questions were expected to be marked. And the reality is that wasn't that successful for the students, and there is that evidence for that. But actually, with the increase of AI and all these various different things, there's a lot we can do to help develop our students, not only in using the tech for the future, but also in their skills for learning. Because we're also not, for a lot of our students, teaching our students about a joy of learning for themselves and finding out things.
I'm going to throw a curveball in. Are we generally seeing kind of teaching training organisations run by people that are kind of been in the classroom a while and then kind of move into teacher training before they retire, as opposed to kind of really good classroom teachers that have been successful and maybe not been in it as long, going and inspiring and teaching kind of the teacher trainers? I don't know the different organisations that we have, that have we got enough younger people, younger teachers inspiring and going and being able to help them and support them and show them to be more tech savvy?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a fine line between both. I mean, I've also had the flipped experience where you get taught in teacher training, admittedly not for a long time because my teacher training was quite comprehensive actually, but I've seen it where you have people training others to teach and they themselves, in their own words, only coped a couple of years in the classroom. And that's not setting you up for success. But
all the teaching providers I've had have been people that are just putting off retirement a little bit longer, so they're just going to do a bit of teacher training. But obviously, I'm going back from like kind of my years and the ones that my other friends were on at the time. Like we all quite had older generation of instructors, so I get it is that fine line, isn't it?
I think there's also the huge thing of that actually the teaching landscape has changed hugely since COVID. It's not a small shift that some people try and portray it as. It's a massive shift. It's a behavioural shift, it's a mental health shift, it's an attitudinal shift from both parents and students, and it's also a public perception shift in how they perceive schools and what we actually do in schools. And I don't think it's that helpful anymore to have teachers who have been out of the classroom for 10 plus years giving advice to new teachers. I actually think it does more harm than good, because it's not giving them any information. There might be some nuggets of useful in there, but they're taking it from one scenario and trying to place it into a completely different scenario. A comprehensive school 10, 15, 20 years ago had way more support staff. They had loads more TAs supporting them. And the reality of it now is you may get a couple of lessons in your week with the TA in, if you're lucky. Otherwise you won't. It's on your own, it's you. And so having a whole session on that and not how to manage your classroom as an individual, as an example, is where we start having sort of conflations. I think you need people going in to do teacher training with these people who are still teaching. They're still on the grindstone, they're still doing it, they still know themselves that they are trying to improve themselves, but actually they can give a reliable perspective that isn't warped by the pre-COVID era, because it is hugely different, and I don't think people want to accept that it's as different as it is.
I think it is. I think the behaviour is different. I think the way children learn is different. I think the way that children engage with education is different. I think the way the parents view education is different, and I think that's the key. Right, I'm just going to play our news for today's show, and then we will be chatting more about kind of teacher training. What is things that you wish you knew, and how can we improve it?
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson edXL's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson edXL MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
It's the summer holidays for almost everyone, but apologies for those not quite finished yet. And the topic of money is not far from the thoughts of many. But Schools Week looks back at the year and reports that nearly 2/3 of schools increased the cost of pupil meals this year, and a large majority of schools have had to make cuts in other areas. The findings are taken from regular government surveys of school leaders and teachers, and results show that over 1/4 of schools say support with energy bills made no real difference to financial positions. The pressure of the cost of living crisis affected schools in several key ways. These included a rise in the cost of pupil lunches, which had to be passed on to many parents. Some schools also reported a decline in meal quality as providers attempted to reduce costs. Cuts to support staff and, in some cases, teaching staff. And schools struggled to comply with new statutory guidance on uniform, with many schools opting to introduce a second-hand uniform scheme to support parents. Recruitment pressures led to schools appointing non-specialist teachers for subjects such as history and technology. This increased workload and stress. SEND pressures also increased, with 87% of those surveyed citing lack of funds and access to specialist services as the key issue. The same publication also featured a story on exam fees, as AQA, England's largest exam board, announced increases for some of its most popular GCSE and A-level subjects, by as much as 16.5%. The changes will affect the 2024 series. The article features details of increases made by Edexcel and OCR2. Jeff Barton, General Secretary of the ASCL Union, responded by saying that this latest price hike will only serve to stretch budgets even further. Exam boards are obliged to notify Ofqual of any proposed fee increases. Ofqual monitors pricing for qualifications from the not-for-profit exam boards. The Guardian covered the nomination of Sir Martin Oliver as Ofsted's next Chief Inspector by Education Secretary Gillian Keegan. A pre-appointment hearing will take place in the autumn, but Ms Keegan said Sir Martin had demonstrated exemplary leadership and praised his work in areas of disadvantage as the Chief Executive of Outwood Grange Academies Trust. Sir Martin said he was hugely privileged to be nominated and that he would work closely with the whole sector to create the best systems in all areas. His promotion comes in spite of criticism, including from Ofsted inspectors, of his trust's record on pupil suspensions and exclusions. The article goes on to highlight the issues Sir Martin may find lurking in his in-tray if he is confirmed for a January 2024 start. These include the outcome of the inquest into the death of Ruth Perry and the calls for a full-scale review of the inspectorate, including the scrapping of single-word judgments. The inspection of children's services at a time when there is a high turnover of social workers and an over-reliance on agency workers who are having to deal with heavy caseloads. He will also have to deal with media and political pressures in a role which could see him regularly in the spotlight. Finally, the BBC reports that the government will break its own deadline to provide schools in England with guidance on policies for transgender pupils. The guidance has been promised before the summer break, but is delayed because the Attorney General for England and Wales has advised parts of the guidance may be unlawful. The guidance was expected to address what schools should do if a child wanted to change their name or use different pronouns, and whether to involve parents. Ministers were considering advising against allowing social transitioning in schools after a 2020 report found that it was not a neutral act, and more information was needed about its outcomes. The Attorney General, however, has said that an outright ban would be unlawful. Ministers now have to decide what to do next: compile lawful guidance or contemplate changing the law altogether. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week we're going to talk about a couple of shortcuts and hacks that can make life a little easier. This may not be as innovative as some of my past life hacks for teachers, like drinking noodles, but here are a couple of things that may make a difference to your use of media in the classroom. First up, if you aren't already riding it, get on the Wakelet wave. Wakelet is a free way to save, organise and share content. Create collections of web pages, videos, and basically anything with a web address under one topic. Once done, you have a shareable link to your collection. Use it to organise your lesson, flip a lesson, or create revision collections, just to throw a few ideas out there. This next hack is one of my favourites. I love using YouTube to support learning. Not only can it help keep pace in a lesson, but also it's a great reference afterwards for pupils to refer to. My biggest gripe with it though is that pesky advert you can't skip that always decides to play when you're in full flow. Here's a secret that works nearly all of the time. When preparing your lesson, you will have watched the clip anyway to ensure it's appropriate, so just before you copy the link into your presentation or Wakelet, type this on the end, and t equals 1. That's the ampersand, or the wiggly and, lowercase t, equals, and the number 1. Now copy the URL with and t equals 1 on the end, and your clip will start 1 second in. Not missing any content, but skipping the adverts at the start. No need to thank me. Show your gratitude with a follow and tell us what you want to know about tech. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
And that's what our trainees should be listening to, shouldn't they? Finding out all those little tips. I did not know that. That's kind of, I'm like, oh, will I remember that in September? Maybe not, but I will try to.
If you embed a video as well in a PowerPoint, it tends to skip the adverts.
But yeah, mine were embedded, but then we moved from Google to Teams, and now they're not. So I've got to go around again. But that's another thing. So we're talking about the fact that kind of how we can best support teacher training and make sure they kind of stay in teacher training. So CEDEC, the Voice for Secondary Education, they were saying that this was in 2022 June, so the end of last year, 77% of early careers teachers were still in teaching after 3 years, and only 68% after 5 years. So is my maths correct? So that's 1 in 4 that leave the profession within the first 3 years. So it's thinking about how we prepare them. Paul's given us a couple. So we've got the best CPD is from schools sharing ideas between each other, which I completely agree with. And that's my other tip is I would say to every trainee, find your staff room and eat in there, or rotate around the different staff rooms. If you've got multiple staff rooms, don't hide in your room and eat your food there, because actually you get to know different people. So for me, A block staff room, that was where I get to know all the cover supervisors and all the LSAs. And if I'm having trouble with students, they will give me tips. Whereas down the other one, if I went down E block staff room, I would kind of get more pedagogical kind of chat about educational research, because it's different people. So it's kind of a school dynamic. Don't pinpoint yourself and just put yourself in one staff room and stick with that, or hide in your room and don't eat with everyone. Go and get involved. And I love I will make sure that I always go and sit and chat and have lunch with a trainee, because I think it's nice to kind of find out how they're getting on and what they're thinking. And I think that's kind of our role as teachers as well, that we check in on them, even if they're nothing to do with our department. It's still kind of nice to include them and speak to them and kind of find out how they're getting on, and know that it is a group effort in a school. You have to have a team, otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah, definitely.
Paul says, in his school, it's part of the Behaviour Hub, a scheme where schools in the region get together once every 3 months to discuss behaviour issues as a way to solve this. It's been so good. Oh, that sounds really good, because it's I think sometimes you can feel really alone as a teacher, and it is reaching out and doing and talking to others. So I'm a national subject lead for our Trust for Art and Design, so I kind of do the same for art. We kind of have online CPD every half a term, and then we have one kind of regional one in the summer term, one in the south and one in the north, because we've got 46 schools, where if the schools are allowed out due to cover, etc., then it's a great opportunity to kind of chat. And also, you just feel like, oh gosh, are you guys struggling with year 9 this year? Yeah, I'm really struggling. Or how was your retention? Did you get a good uptake? Because for us it was quite interesting after the pandemic, because we went full on as soon as we could teach in our classrooms. We went full on practical, because we hadn't been doing it previously, and actually that meant that we had a really big uptake, where other schools, because they stuck in their classrooms longer than we did, and then perhaps. So I think having those other people and seeing what other schools are doing is really important as well, especially in your early years. Like, because if you feel like you can't talk to your department for whatever reason, it's really important to kind of reach out. Same as, I don't know whether it's the same with other subjects. We have network of East Anglian art teachers, and I know there's a south one and a northern one as well, because we were kind of inspired and made our own down here, and again we meet up every now and then and run workshops where we train each other, but basically it's just time to go and have a bit of a chat and bond with other art teachers across the region. But I don't know whether are there things like that for science?
Not as far as I'm aware of. I mean, I think there's an interesting point you've made there, where it's actually really school and department specific in that who's leading you. Because in different schools I've worked at, I mean, I've had schools that would just reject any support offered by a trust because they think they were doing it better, and so as a trainee in that school, you'd get very limited outside influence other than your department. Especially if the department lead is sort of resistant to outside support. But then, yeah, I think it's just hugely dependent, because I mean, some schools are really only seem to want trust stuff. So we'll do this because our trust offers it, and it's all within trust, and it's all to do with the trust or the academy chain. And then others seem to be a bit more open to outside influences. I also think it depends what's available. I mean, some lead practitioners can be really on it with certain things and not others, and I think that there's all different things going on. I mean, our trust at the moment is getting programs of study and curriculums done and moving across the board. So in both science and PSHE, we're rolling those out. But I think, yeah, it depends on where you can get support, because it is very useful, and having done more of it in the last sort of year or two, I can really see the benefit. But I remember being trained and being in my NQT year, and there was literally no outside influence.
And I think that's the thing, isn't it? With it, sorry, you finish.
Well, the only outside influence was stuff that I went and sought out in my own time. There was nothing within school that was done. Even the ECT program at the time, because it was all online, it was all very single dimensional, one person talking, very little interaction, and it was almost put that on whilst you mark.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing with a trust. It's a fine line, isn't it? You can, if you've got these centralized curriculums or what have you that schools can roll out, then you don't want to reinvent the wheel. If there's something that somebody's already doing that you can borrow and take, like, I don't think there's a bit of a thing, isn't there, where it's like, oh, but that's my resources. I spent time. I made that. But like, actually, we need to collaborate more as a whole in terms of as teachers. Like, we need to support each other. I've already seen online somebody going, oh, I'm spending my summer rewriting the photography curriculum. Has anybody got anything? I've been asked to rewrite this. Does anybody have anything for 3D? Because we're now trying to include that in art. And I'm like, these poor people that are going to be spending their summers kind of creating curriculums. I'm like, no, here's mine, already done, have it. And I quite like that. And sometimes I know, Paul, you're primary, like we have 8 primary schools within our trust, and quite often the primary art leads are also the leads for music and DT and other areas. So they're not necessarily art teachers. So it's quite nice working with them, and I can be like, here you go, here are these. Or I've worked with different companies that actually create there's a website called Teach Your Class to Draw, where they have a video that you play your students, and they have a video that you watch as a teacher before the lesson, so it upskills you then play the lesson, and then you get your kids to follow along, and there's a whole entire series so they can follow along and kind of do that their drawing. So it's knowing where to look for the resources, but not feeling as a trainee. I think there's so much emphasis, isn't there? You need to write your lesson plan, you need to plan this, you need to plan that, and actually we need to be kind of twisting it and be like, you need to go find this and then adapt it for your students. And I think that narrative could change in terms of teacher training, that it's perfectly acceptable to share resources. It's perfectly acceptable. If you want to pay a quid on tests and make your life easier, go for it. Because like, actually those people have put a lot of time into those resources, hopefully, and they're pretty decent. So if you want to pay a couple of quid for their time but gain multiple hours of your own time, then I think kind of that kind of scenario is perfectly acceptable. And actually we need to kind of have more encouragement as kind of the collaborative process, rather than it's seen as like, oh, I'm just going to download a freebie for cover. Like, and I think like the Oaks started doing it, I suppose, with COVID, but I know certainly like from the art perspectives, all of those are kind of gone and obsolete, and you certainly wouldn't been able to teach them for like keep providing it as cover because the kids would have already done that, and there wasn't a huge amount kind of offered. But I think having those places where you can go and see what a quality resource is, so you know how, and then take that and adapt it, should be seen as perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, actually, interestingly, my teacher trainer through the university that I was at had a saying that was like, magpie it. If there's something you like, magpie it, and keep passing it on and keep sharing. And she the first thing she said, and I remember the first week was, right, everybody get a USB or a hard drive, and every time you go somewhere, download the stuff, download the things that you need, and then just keep adding to it, because if all else fails and you can't find a resource, you can do a whole device search and find it. And I still have that same thing. I've continued to do that, and it's a lifesaver. But I think you're definitely right. Sharing resources is so valuable, and actually, but also being able to tell what makes a good resource and a bad resource. And but also, for example, cover's an interesting one, because we're all told to set cover, but very rarely does anybody actually give you any feedback on your cover.
No, we're not. We're never taught how to set cover properly.
No.
How to like that should be in your teacher training. That should be in everybody's inset for like, even if it's 15 minutes at the start of every year. How to set good cover, what expectations are for cover, and feedback from the teachers. Because I know our cover supervisors will say like yours in English are the best cover resources because they're so easy to follow, like, but that's just because I had so many people off sick at the start of my teaching career at this school. I wrote every lesson with videos where I basically recorded how to do it, and I suppose that also came about with Loom as well. Like I kept that on from COVID, so in COVID I recorded the videos and spoke along my PowerPoints and sent them home. But like when I have cover now, I'll do a quick Loom video where I talk through the PowerPoint, and then that way the LS, there's no confusion. As long as the LS, the cover teacher plays it, then there's no kind of miscommunication of what I was expecting to happen, if that makes sense as well. So, and then those lessons aren't wasted.
Yeah, I think it's hard because also there needs to be a fine line here between what staff are expected to set for cover, because already, I mean, unless it's a planned cover, teachers don't, as far as I'm aware, officially have to set cover.
No.
But really, the reality is we all do, because it otherwise it makes our lives a nightmare. But we all set cover and we all do all these things, but it can be from all over the place. I mean, I've set cover from my phone in a car before, steaming whilst my partner's driven me down the motorway somewhere. Or in a hospital waiting room, you're just texting your colleague where each class is and what something they could do for them to write it for you. And I mean,
I have written cover from a hospital bed a lot this year.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think there's a lot of very innovative things being done with cover. I know there was a post in TES a couple of months ago, might have been longer actually, about a school that any time a class had cover, they'd just go to a computer room, and there would be somebody whose permanent position was to be in that computer room and running cover. And so that member of staff felt way more secure in what they were doing because they knew what was going to happen. Staff would just point to a lesson on Oak Academy or another resource, and students would just get on with it, and the staff member would have visibility of what's going on, and behaviour dropped, or negative behaviour dropped with regards to cover lessons, and that school decided that was a lot of a smoother way to go.
Because these are the little things that we aren't told about when we train, that we should kind of be included. And I think like that's one of my things. I always make sure there's one or two cover lessons in my scheme of work that are written in my scheme of work that have everything ready in the pad, and I literally have to be like, that lesson, go, and like everyone knows kind of what they needed to do. Granted, it was a bit more difficult when I was off for a longer period of time, but I didn't really have to do a huge amount because I knew that I had pre-planned that. I was ready for that.
Yeah, Paul's put something interesting. He said he had to do a subject lead Ofsted interview from bed via Zoom with COVID, and it is true, we do go above and beyond, because I mean, that's what it all comes down to, isn't it? Regardless of the conversation, teachers tend to go above and beyond to try and support their students the best we can. And I think that the problem, going back to our original point today, like the recruitment and retention problem, comes from teachers not feeling like they're being successful at that.
And I think it's that, like, I broke my foot and I had a week off and then got taxis into work and then got a DVT and again had a week off and then got taxis into work and then got pulmonary embolism, where I finally had 2 weeks off work and then half term, but then I came back after. But in reality, I was signed off for kind of 6 months and I should have just been off. But that it was way easier to go in and be. I still believe that the students had a better me on half kind of capability of just kind of not being able to wander around the room. I can still teach better sat at the front than them to have had 6 months of cover. And also I love those students. I have kind of a responsibility. I didn't want to do that to them and their GCSEs, but I think that there is that kind of well-being side of teaching, that we don't put ourselves first, and actually we do need to teach our trainees that it's okay to, if you're ill, but this is how you set good cover so you're not disadvantaging the students. This is how you the procedures that you follow, and kind of and make them aware that they can say no. Like, if you're ill, you're ill.
Yeah,
I feel like as teachers we very much need to be on deathbed before we don't go in.
But that's the problem, is no matter how much we tell our trainees that, they're never going to do it, because they see, and I was one of those, that I saw other people pulling in ridiculous things, being ill, still being at work. I mean, and for my first few years, I had a phenomenal head of department who would literally send you home. Like, if you turned up too ill, she would write your cover for you and send you home, and it would be done, and that would be it. And I was very thankful for that. I mean, like, we did have to be on death's door, but it got taken seriously, and we never really had any sort of questions about if we were taking the mick. But it's very hard to sit and tell a trainee it's easy to say the words, but the reality is if all of what they're seeing is teachers pulling in ill and with lost voices, and they've got tonsillitis but they're still here, and someone's got a chest infection but they're making it in, then when they actually are ill, they're not going to stay at home, because there's the, I'm not ill enough because so and so made it in without it.
Yeah. I think I'm going to go back to one of the things Paul said earlier about making sure that students are kind of having their placements in different demographic areas and they're experiencing different schools. But I do also think that the caveat in there they have to be good schools. You don't want to go into a school that just isn't prepared for you to be there, with a not very good mentor that kind of doesn't really know what they're doing and I've just been asked, but they weren't really expecting it, kind of thing. Because I had a student a few years ago, and they came to me and they told me that their old school had put them as outstanding, and I was like, watch them teach. I'm like, you are not outstanding, and we kind of went through things, and I'm like, I ended up having to fail them on the second term, and granted they came back and turned it around on the third term, but I was like, how is that first school said that you're outstanding when you're barely teaching anything? And I think we do need to have standards in terms of teacher training, but we need to be teaching them properly. Like, she was very much like, I need to do this. I need to, what are you going to assess? Because if you assess, we all are assessing. Everybody in the department are assessing, because we can't have your kids getting a extra advantage over anybody else's. So if you're assessing, we're all assessing. Secondly, how does it benefit the students? We're not assessing for you to tick a box. We're assessing because the kids need to benefit from it. So how are you assessing it that is going to benefit them? And third, if we're all doing it and we're doing it at this point, how is it going to be time effective that we're all not going to waste our time? Because you may only have the one group that you're teaching, but I've got 4 and the other teacher's got another couple. So if we're going to, granted we're quicker, but and it completely changed her logic in terms of how she thought about kind of the teacher training. And same as before that, she was like, oh, I like kind of telling the kids off, and had kind of scare tactics, almost kind of behavior thing. I was like, you need to I'm not going to pass you on behavior until you get to know those kids, engage in the kids and get to know them, like really kind of individualize them. And as soon as she started doing that and really got to know them, she did like a rewards game with them, and they were like putty in her hands. I was like, you need to be focusing on praising them rather than just telling them off. And as soon as she did that, and actually they were like kind of looking for the things that they could do right to get attention from her and get praise, they were different animals. And then she was able to kind of really control that class. And I think, I don't know whether, I mean, obviously I've done a lot of mentor training, but a lot of that is stuff that I've volunteered for, again, because they're free, but also because I just love it. And I'm slightly addicted to CPD. So I've been like, yeah, I want to train, and I want to know how to be the best mentor I can be. But there's got to be a lot of things, onus on the schools, that we're picking the right mentors for the trainees and that they're properly equipped. And also that communication between the providers and the mentors, because I feel that they're quite separate. Like, I don't really know what they're being taught on the Friday. I wait and kind of get told by my trainee after the fact, and it's like, it would be quite nice to kind of have a real like up to date what they're doing and kind of be able to blend that into what I'm doing to really emphasize things, to make sure that the teachers, the student and the mentors and the training provider are all on the same page. There was probably a good 100 teachers there, and everybody was kind of saying the same thing, bar a couple of people that had obviously got really good providers, but they just said that it was a bit of a minefield. You were getting not as good a quality trainees, and the information they were being provided wasn't as good. So the training, it seemed to be very much, you've got to pass them regardless. And I don't think that's the case. I think we need to have a rigorous system, but it needs to be a system that supports them. And because we're not doing it properly, we're not creating trainees that are able to go on and kind of, they can be and then struggle.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting thing alongside that, and Paul said something about the communication between mentor and mentee. I think there's a lot to say about that, though, because I've had students who I've not been the mentor for, but I've ended up doing a chunk of work with, because they end up getting feedback from so many different places, that actually being able to narrow that down to what actually do I need to improve. Because sometimes I think mentors might have their half an hour a week with their person, and they might see them teach or and things, but they're not seeing them in all these different classrooms. And actually sometimes it needs a different set of eyes to sit and say, look, okay, this is the area that you're struggling with. Here are some real things. Here's a thing that sounds silly, but actually, like, if you do it a few times, almost play a game with yourself when you're teaching, it might work. So, for example, one of my trainees was not keeping the pace with students and sort of sending them off to do things and not giving them noise reminders or anything like that. And I set a tally of, okay, in this lesson I want to hear 30 noise reminders. And it sounds like, it was something that my mentor did with me when I first trained, and it sounds like a silly target, but actually what it teaches you to do is be really aware of the instructions that you're giving and be really intentional with them and actually use them properly, rather than just sort of hovering and that there's a place for pastor's perch and seeing what people are doing and keeping on track with people's that way. But actually them hearing a vocal reminder that yes, you're still paying attention and they still need to be hustling with their work is always worth it. But it's hard because there's quite a lot of people at play in any teacher training. There's the trainee, there's the mentor, then there's the lead person within the school, and then there's the potentially other teachers within the school that are having classes taken by that trainee. Then there's the teacher trainer provider. So there's a lot of different people going on for one person trying to hone a skill that they that they have no practice with.
And I think it's one of those, like, a few weeks ago I had Jim Knight on about his book Instructional Coaching, and I highly recommend that one to anybody that's being a mentor, and kind of getting them to analyse their lesson and explain where they think their weaknesses are, and kind of getting them to do more of the talking, but then also then to give them different strategies, but get them to pick which strategy would work best. So they're kind of making more conscious decisions about their learning and building up their toolkit as to what works for which lessons. And I think there's also that idea of making them realise that as trainees, we need to realise that every lesson isn't going to be an outstanding lesson. Like, generally we run on kind of like 60-70%, like on a good day. Like, we're not going to be all bells, whistles, amazing lessons, because we simply, like we said at the start, just don't have the time to be pulling out these awesome lessons. It's not physically possible to be doing that constantly, because you just don't have the energy or the time or the capacity to do that. And that actually the perfect lesson doesn't exist on a daily basis. It's you'll have those lessons, and it won't be the lesson that you expect it to be, that you'll think, oh, this one I put loads of effort in, it's really well planned, it's going to go perfect, it's going to be great. That one will go awful. But the lesson that you don't plan as well, that actually ends up being amazing, that's the one that you'll remember after. And I think it's teaching them to adapt and change and not be afraid to go kind of off piece, because that's the best thing about being a teacher, when a kid throws you a curveball and you actually like makes you rethink how you're going to teach it. And each time you do teach things, you do develop and change. Like, I still have lessons that I'm teaching that are 10 years old, but I still change them every single time. I teach it a different way. And that's what I like about teaching. That's what is so great about teaching. And I think it's losing that perfectionism, but that having that need to be able to adapt constantly is really important.
Yeah, and I think that all of that is really important. And I said to trainees before, it's all about raising your average lesson. So it's not about how you can have one amazing lesson, but you need to understand how to raise your average lesson. And often, like, a theme for the week is better than, we're going to try this thing and that thing, and you should improve this, that, and the other. Just saying, okay, this week we are going to focus on this one thing. You're going to get really good at this one thing, and then next week we'll have a different focus, and keep going like that. And actually, I think that takes away some of the noise that people can feel. But also, everybody needs to be told that you're going to have an awful lesson. Everyone has an awful lesson, and it happens more than once, where you might have planned it and you think it's great and you've put everything in place, and for whatever reason, it all just goes up in the air, and you end up leaving the lesson half wanting to cry, half sort of because you've put all this effort in and nothing's come to fruition, and the other half because sometimes you don't even know particularly what caused it to go so wrong, because only on reflection can you really work that out. But actually, I think sometimes saying that to trainee teachers and being honest with them about it is something that sometimes isn't done.
And that kind of understanding that life will go on, kids will go on, and that when we fail, or if we miss a day of school, or if we like say, actually no, we can't do that, or even leave a school, sometimes you feel like you can't leave a school, and it's like life goes on, you're replaceable, the kids are resilient, like I said, me going off sick, like yes, they took a bit of work to get back on target, but actually they're resilient, they're fine, they will get on, they'll be okay. Like, it's you don't need to stay up till midnight creating a resource. Actually, what you've done beforehand is probably going to be fine, and you can just adapt it in the lesson. Like, they're better off having you on a good night's sleep than you having stayed up to silly o'clock trying to recall something. And I think that goes for the performers as well, in terms of the lesson plans and things that students need to fill in. Like, we don't really fill in lesson plans anymore. Granted, I've got schemes of work, and it's really important that they understand how schemes of work and how the sequencing works and how the interleaving of information works. But the workload of having to write like a ridiculous amounts of lesson plans, but then that might be just me, because I was doing mine whilst teaching a 0.8% timetable, and I wrote a lesson plan for every one of those. But so I'm like,
we've got a huge problem, because we teach them how to write a lesson plan,
and then they never use it again.
But also nobody tells them how to not write a lesson plan.
Yeah.
Like, we all let's be honest about it. We don't all sit writing a lesson plan. It's not that we don't think about our lessons and plan them, but I don't know any teacher that does these huge long lesson plans. But we all still plan a lesson and think about things to include in a lesson.
Yeah.
And I think actually somebody needs to talk to these trainees about, well, what's the bridging step between these hugely long lesson plans. And I mean, I know Teacher Toolkit has a 5-minute lesson plan that's a good sort of gap fill or step over. But yeah, I mean, I used to have when I first trained to teach, because science, obviously you've got chemicals, you've got all these different things everywhere. And I remember having a really bad lesson during training. And ultimately it wasn't my fault. It was because there'd been a fight in the corridor 10 minutes before my lesson started. and I had 3 of the kids who were in the fight return to my lesson halfway through my lesson. So it was never going to be a solid lesson or practical. But my mentor just and me sat down afterwards, and we had a bit of a laugh about it. And I felt really bad that the lesson hadn't gone to plan. And she said something that I think I will always stick with me, which is, will doctors have this first do no harm? And actually, teachers have the same. First do no harm. Did your kids get from the start of the lesson to the end of the lesson safely? Right, yes. Okay. Did they manage to learn something? It might not have been everything that you wanted them to learn, but did they get to the end of the lesson knowing something they didn't know at the start? And if the answer is yes, you've been successful. It doesn't mean that you've reached peak success, you've done everything you wanted to do, but actually there are lessons that are like that you get to the end of the lesson and it just, the lesson happened and you've got to move on from it. But I think sometimes that's not necessarily spoken about, and we spend so much time talking to trainees about how to get their teaching practice perfect, which in itself doesn't exist, that actually trying to say to students and trainee teachers, look, sometimes it just goes wrong. Like, you can set up some of these science practicals. I mean, there's a particular biology one, but it rarely works. And so, if it works, it's a bonus. But otherwise, we can sit around watching some colour change to happen that will never happen. And that's okay. And you kind of have to just explain it and move on.
It is that whole thing of I think we should teach them more about resilience and how to adapt. Like, how do you cope when you've got kids coming in middle way of the lesson or somebody disturbing your lesson? How do you cope when, for example, a school not far away from ours got hacked and they weren't allowed to use the internet and they had to teach out of books. They like the older teachers were fine. They were like, "Yep, we're okay. We know how to teach out of textbooks." New teachers, no, didn't have a clue. They were like, "What?" So it's that kind of resilience to be able to adapt.
When I first trained to teach, one of my mentors made me do an entire teaching day with just a whiteboard pen and a pen.
Yeah, I think it's important that they look at different things and looks at different styles. But I think in terms of the teaching planning and the performers and stuff, I think rather than writing these lesson statements and stuff, yes, you need to know what they need to know, what their prior information is, and what their key concepts are. What are they going to walk out knowing you out of your lesson? But that shouldn't be a huge, massive thing. But it should be all about what your kids' learning styles are and what support and what things you need to do. And I think also that idea of how you plan when you're teaching a full timetable is really important. Like, me and my friend joked that she came over and asked me, she's like, the maths teachers are taking the mickey out of my planner because this is how I write out what I do for the week. And she literally had a sentence on each one of what she was going to teach. And I was like, yeah, that's how I write my planner. I know what that lesson is, that all my schemes of work are written. I just have to write a sentence or a couple of words and I know what I'm doing with that class. And maths, they write it all fully out, like in their planners, what they're doing for every lesson. And I think that kind of idea of what do you need to know? How can you prep for a week and the following week, and knowing, like, I write 3-4 weeks in advance, and then when we have strikes and I have to shuffle everything up, or a GL assessment and shuffle everything, and then a course that I forgot about and I've got to shuffle everything. Like, I can see the impact of that, and which lessons do I take out of that scheme in order to catch that lesson up. The class that always has a lesson on a Monday, so therefore they've missed 4 or 5 lessons because of a bank holiday, versus the other groups that haven't. How do I make sure that they still get the learning that the other groups get? They're the things that you need to know as a teacher that you are not taught as a trainee, and I think would better adapt them to be able to cope when they come to a full timetable.
I think the problem is the people who are leading a lot of these teacher trainings are removed from that reality, because oftentimes they've become a head of department or an assistant principal and then gone into teacher training at a later point, and they've almost forgotten the full teaching load situation, and you almost need the staff romantics. I mean, in science, in most schools, the science teachers will be found in the prep room, and so there's a lot of jokes and a lot of online groups about the science teachers prep room and where you can go. That's where you go and find information, because as a trainee science teacher, you need to just sit in a prep room for days on end and just soak in from the lab techs and taking the information from the different teachers coming in and going out, and the tips and tricks that make a difference. And in doing that, you pick up all this information that it would be hard for a person to sit and distill to you. I think this is the thing, is we almost have this fallacy of, if you that there's two ends of a spectrum, that you're either, or a binary actually, people seem to think you either can tell somebody how to do something better, or they learn by experience. And the thing is, there is this middle ground where it isn't that, it's them sort of taking in information slowly and then starting to embed it along the way. That isn't experience. They don't need to do it 12 times to know how to do it. They might just need to hear that nugget at the right time.
I think that's exactly it. We need to be giving them more skills of how to cope when they get to full time, because I think it's this whole kind of building it up, but it's actually quite a quick process, being a 1 year induction into teaching, and that actually when we get there, we kind of then panic and you're on your own and you don't really know what you're doing. So it's kind of knowing where support is and how to be supported, and kind of what the best things are, and also not to put the pressure on yourselves, where what is a good teacher versus an excellent teacher. They're the ones that can adapt and learn and know what to do and know how to cope, and know where you cut and where you focus and how you gain your time back. Because this is a profession that if you want to have longevity in, you need to be able to protect yourself and protect your home life and not be kind of doing it continuously. You need to be able to have that balance, and that it's healthy to say no and know where your limits are, because we could put every hour we possibly could into teaching and we still wouldn't be happy, because we're teachers and we want to do the best, and education is continuously changing, and that's just what we do. But it's kind of understanding those and getting, for people's well-being, I guess, understanding that balance. But yeah, I think on the note of the fact I've just seen a surfboard be carried into my lounge, that is the point to end the show. Thank you so much for joining me, Lydia and Paul, and chatting away. Yeah, so we're going to completely reform teaching, training, and solve the retention process. So no problems at all.
Bye.
Bye. Have a lovely summer, everybody. I'll be back on your Monday night soon.